It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to another wonderful episode of your favorite Shakespeare authorship mystery podcast. It is always great to have this very popular guest return to the program, Catherine Chilgen. Catherine, did you know that you hold the record for the most popular episode in Don't Quill the Messenger history?
I'm shocked. Thank you. What an honor.
Your first episode with me is still gaining ground on all the other episodes, more than 100 different episodes, with the number of individual downloads it receives month after month as new listeners continue to join the Quiller Nation, and also listeners go back and listen to some of their favorite hits. And you hold the record right now as the most popular guest in the 5-year history of the program.
Wow. Well, thank you. That's wonderful news.
So it's fabulous to have you back here to discuss your latest work, which is a paper that you had published in a recent special issue of the Journal of Scientific Exploration, where you go into your research on the details of early court performances that sure do appear to be early versions of what would later become plays with the brand name Shakespeare placed upon them.
Yes. And it was a work that I started back in 2012. Pretty much wrote the paper, and then I gave it as a presentation in Concordia University at the Edward de Vere Study Conference, which unfortunately is not going anymore. After I gave it, I just kind of put it to the side, and I never really got back to it because I had other things I was working on. And then Don Rubin had a call for papers for a journal, and so I thought, oh, this would be a good time to, revisit my paper that I started so long ago. And I accepted it, and the paper was accepted, and in a way, I think I rewrote most of it because a lot more new research came to light for me, and then that resulted in the publication. And that's why we're here.
Well, I've gone through that issue, which is a remarkable issue filled with some of the prominent names in Oxfordianism. But I found myself just so intrigued by your paper because I particularly, as a theater artist, have a belief that the plays of Shakespeare that as we know them today were actually, many of which we didn't see until the first folio, were actually prepared for the folio for posterity and not for performance. And I have a strong belief that many of them existed in some sort of draft form or early performance form. And I long have held the belief that they existed out there for quite some time, sometimes decades, before they were actually put into print, and that they were first performed for, and in fact, even in some cases, I believe, written for an audience of one, and that audience of one being Queen Elizabeth herself.
I agree with you. And we're very fortunate that we have surviving records of the Queen's revels. And they weren't very complete. They didn't always give a title. Sometimes they give a title, sometimes they gave props or the expenses. Sometimes they just give character names. So with that as something to grab hold on and look into, that's how we've come up. Really, not me initially, Eva Turner Clarke. She was the one in 1931 or 32 in her book, Hidden Allusions in Shakespeare's Plays. She, gathered these titles, and she's very much an Oxfordian, very early Oxfordian. And she was trying to tie the history of the time and Edward de Vere's association with that history and applying it to the play. So she was always kind of had Edward de Vere in mind. And she really went into the history more than I do in my paper. My paper is more neutral, and it's just trying to give evidence that some of these rebels records were talking about Shakespeare plays. And then I try and give literary allusions in works of other authors that may support that. And as you know, in my book, Shakespeare Suppressed, I have over 90, quote unquote, too early allusions to the plays. And since then, I've really augmented that. And I've included a few of these in this paper, which is very long, but I think it's more compelling that way.
It is a lengthy piece, but it reads so quickly and it goes so smoothly. And it's interesting that you point out that you wrote it with more of a neutral, sort of objective journalistic attitude. And it just proves my point that writers write to their audience. And here I believe, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, that you were writing to the audience of who you perceived would be reading this journal of scientific exploration in the hopes that you might be finding some new mystery seekers who are brand new to the topic and suddenly go, hey, this is worth looking into. And without sort of beating them over the head with the message that Oxford wrote it, just more of a, hey, there's a lot to look at here. And if you really are a scientist, if you really are approaching this with a sort of scientific mind, this is something that requires more research and more exploration to get to the bottom of.
Yes, you summed it up very well. And also, it's kind of logical. Something I discovered when I started revisiting the evidence is that King James I, who succeeded Elizabeth, it's on record that he saw 17 different Shakespeare plays. And I didn't know that until recently. And yet the record shows for Queen Elizabeth that she only saw 3. She saw, according to the title pages, Love Labour's Lost and Midsummer's Night's Dream. Merry Wives of Windsor and Richard II. That's about all that they can really account for. So it doesn't make sense that King James saw 17 and the Queen only 3. And yet Ben Jonson wrote in the first folio that the Shakespeare plays so took Queen Elizabeth and King James. So I think she saw more than 3. And it's totally logical that she may have seen these plays, Shakespeare plays, but they were just written under different titles at that time. And my paper spans from 1562 to 1584. Now, of course, the first date would be the Stratford man wasn't even alive. So, I mean, that would kind of nullify him, and it may be hard to believe. But anyway, I try to present the evidence and leave it at that and see what people think.
Well, it's exceptional to think in orthodoxy that these plays, when they were first written, had an individual title, and they stuck with that title, and the title never changed. That doesn't even happen in modern times. In fact, most films go through multiple titles. I'm speaking just from an entertainment perspective because that's my specialty, right? You have films that are out there right now that the title is actually called working title. There's a film company called Working Title Productions that sort of makes a play on that. So the titles of films change during the process of the film making. A screenwriter can write a piece and give it a title, and the movie studio decides, no, that title doesn't work. We're changing that. Most recently, I had the pleasure of interviewing and then later working with Elizabeth Winkler on helping to promote her book. And she talks very extensively about how it was the publishing company that changed the title of her book and decided on the final title. So, I mean, here's a thing where you have to look at, if that's what's happening in today's world, then it must have been happening back then as well, especially when you had a group of people together working on putting together a play. And, you know, theater is such a collaborative art form. that, I always imagined that you had people like even Kemp, for instance, saying, oh, can we change this line right here? It'd be a lot funnier. And, maybe some of the great dramatists were working along with their actors in the writing of the scenes or in the forming of the dialogue. And, over too much wine late at night, they said, oh, this is a better title. Let's change the title, because that happens all the time in real life.
Yes. Well, it happened in King James's time, and I can give you 3 examples. King James saw Caesar's tragedy, which the Orthodox scholars say that was Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. James saw the Moor of Venice, which was Othello, according to Orthodox scholars, and he saw the Hotspur, which was a character in Henry IV, part 2, I think, or part 1, one of those. And so certainly they did appear under different titles. So why couldn't these early plays and masks have been Shakespeare works under different titles? It makes perfect sense.
It does indeed. And, when you point out that obviously James was a lover of the works of Shakespeare, 17 plays. In fact, I always like to say King James created the very first Shakespeare festival, because there is that historical account where he ordered basically a series of 8 different Shakespeare plays to be performed during the holiday revels and marriage ceremonies that were occurring during that year, which happened to include one of the De Vere daughters, if I recall, which is an interesting thing that he would do there. Oh, you're getting married. Let's order a bunch of your father's plays to be performed while we all enjoy this marriage season and holiday season together. I mean, it just smacks of, hey, hello, ding, ding, ding. But I do think it's so interesting that you point out how many of these plays have these earlier potential titles that Elizabeth must have loved first. And it does make sense when you look at the content of many of the plays, even in the form we have them now, that they were written to send messages to her and the members of her court, not to James and the members of his court. It wouldn't have made a lot of sense.
Exactly. Especially like they think that Twelfth Night was a lampooning of Christopher Hatton. And of course, the time when they think it was written, like circa 1600 or 1601, he had been dead for 10 years. So, I mean, things like that just don't fit anymore. They had to have been written earlier.
You begin the paper with, as you mentioned just a moment ago, that, tragedy of Caesar, or Caesar's tragedy, which we now know becomes Julius Caesar. And you talk about the earliest versions of Julius Caesar and the earliest versions of Antony and Cleopatra. I just recently did bonus feature episodes on both of those plays and how they tie back to Oxford. But missing from my episodes and my discussion are these earlier versions that you talk about. Share with the listeners a little bit about that, because it sort of will augment those who have tuned into the bonus features and help them understand the early origins of these two sort of compendium plays.
Yes. Well, it appears that Julius Caesar was one of Shakespeare's very earliest. And we have that based upon a current event that was recorded by a citizen of London. He had seen in February of 1562 more than 150 people dressed in gilt harness and torchbearers and trumpeters and drummers marching through the streets of London toward the Queen's court for a masque. And he even called it a masque, right? And also among them was the character Julius Caesar. So presumably this masque that the Queen was going to see was about Julius Caesar. And that scene that he described echoes the opening scene of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, where Julius Caesar and his train are walking through the streets to an enthusiastic crowd, rejoicing of him being there. So there's right away a distinct parallel. And also, that same year, in November of 1562, we have Arthur Brooke in his long poem called Romeus and Juliet, seems to have a Shakespeare allusion. And let me do that.
Well, while you're pulling that up, just to reference that,
Sorry.
That Julius Caesar opening scene, which I know very well because I've produced and directed the play multiple times. It's the opening scene. It's the festival of the Lupercalia, which would have been in February, which is what we now call Valentine's Day. When we look at. And so we're talking about basically 1 month before the assassination of Caesar. So we look at Julius Caesar, and it begins about a month before the historic Ides of March. And the Lupercalian, if you recall in the beginning of the play, Caesar says to Antony, when you run by Calpurnia, don't forget to strike her so that she will become fertile and deliver me an heir. And the festival of the Lupercalia, the Roman men would run this race, and the women would line the race course, and the men would carry what were called februa, which were leather straps, goatskin straps. And as they ran by, they would strike the women with the straps to help them become fertile. That was the belief. And it's a terrible story, but it's the truth. And it's where we get the word February from. So we actually have a month of the year that is named after the straps of leather used to strike women around Valentine's Day. And that's a true story, ladies and gentlemen. Look that up if you don't believe me.
Wow. So you're saying that the opening of Julius Caesar was taking place in February.
Yes, correct.
Just like the citizen of London saw this parade go by in February.
So I think, look at that connection there.
Amazing.
That's an incredible tie together there. And certainly somebody who knew their Roman history would be aware of that. And the only way you could be aware of those kinds of details of Roman history is if you were studying that history from the masters who wrote it and had access to the library and could read those works in Latin.
Well, that's marvelous. Thank you. I really learned something there. That really supports the case.
It certainly does.
I was referring to, go ahead.
No, did you find your Romulus and Julius?
Yeah, I did. And that was Arthur Brooke in November of 1562. And it's just a line parallel. In Arthur Brooke's poem, a friar tells a weeping Romeus that manly reason is quite from off thy mind outchased, and that the friar stood in doubt if Romeus a man or woman wert, or else a brutish beast. Okay? So that's in Romeus. And then in Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, with eyes red as fire with weeping, chides men for not mourning Caesar's death, that they have lost their reason and that their judgment has fled to brutish beasts. So it's a line parallel. And it has nothing to do with Romeo and Juliet. It's about Julius Caesar.
Well, that's interesting because then it pops up in Romeo and Juliet when Friar Lawrence says to a weeping Romeo who has been banished, art thou a man? Thy tears are womanish, and thou hast fled to brutish beast. He uses it again. It's in Romeo and Juliet as well.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. And also
Romeo says something to the effect of, when Friar Lawrence accuses him of acting like an animal, Romeo says something to, I would rather be an animal because even the smallest mouse on floor will get to enjoy Juliet, but I will not. I am banished.
Yes. Well, yes. So there's, I think Arthur Brooke saw his original play and of Romeo and Juliet too, because in the introduction of his poem, he says that his poem was based on a drama that he had seen. So, and they don't. All the scholars don't know which drama that was.
It has to be Romeo and Juliet.
Fathom it.
The scene is so perfectly similar. I mean, it's ridiculous how closely tied together those words are. I mean, if you take the text of Romeo and Juliet with Romeo in Friar Lawrence's cell, it's almost identical to Brooks' poem.
There you go. I know. That's why it had to have already been in existence, and Julius Caesar as well. And also in just a couple years later, in 1566, there's George Gascoigne's, his play The Supposes, and he uses the phrase, "is Greek to me." And of course, Julius Caesar made famous, "it's Greek to me."
Yeah, it's Casca, the Senator Casca, who is plucked by the sleeve to tell Brutus and Cassius what occurred on the Lupercalia, up on the festival dais, when Antony tries to present the crown to Caesar, and he 3 times denies the crown, and then Casca says that Cicero gets up and speaks something in Greek, and they ask him, well, what does it say? What did he say? And Casca says, well, for my part, it was all Greek to me. Very famous line.
Yeah, well, it was Shakespeare's play that made that line famous, but Gascoigne may have heard it from the earlier Julius Caesar masque or play that was already then in existence. It's an exciting,
very exciting, very interesting connection there. Let's move on to Antony and Cleopatra and what you've discovered about potential early versions of that play that may have been performed before the Queen.
Well, that was not one of the ones that I included in the paper. But what I did include under Julius Caesar was that in 1582, in February, at Oxford University, they call it a festival of plays. There were 8 plays performed, I think, by the students, at Oxford University, right? And one of them was called Caesar Murdered. And we know about this play only because a Latin epilogue, an epilogue to it, written in Latin, survives. And it was written by Richard Eads. And he moralizes on this play, Caesar Murdered, which in Latin it's Caesarius interfecti. And he, in moralizing it, it's just a couple paragraphs. He mentions Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, and Anthony. And those are all characters in Shakespeare's play. We don't know if Eads wrote this play, Caesar Murdered, but it's not likely because he was a theology student and later a preacher. So it's not likely. So that to me is a very interesting possibility. And another preacher, Humphrey Lawrence, wrote also about all these festival of plays that happened in 1582. And he mentions the uncontrolled love of Anthony for Cleopatra. So it was only one line. And then he makes one line notices about the other plays, including Caesar Murdered. So it's kind of a tantalizing allusion that did 2 Shakespeare plays exist as of 1582? And were they already popular at the university?
Well, actually, what I found and what I believe to be true is that Antony and Cleopatra as a story was sort of dramatized by others first, including Mary Sidney, by the way, who reprinted it and reprinted it and reprinted it for more than a decade. And the Shakespeare version, as we know it, comes much later. And it makes sense to me that that would be the case, because I don't know that it was meant to be performed for the Queen. I don't think she would have taken very kindly to the representation of
Was
her.
that not a translation?
It was. Mary Sidney's translation? Yes, it was.
Yeah.
I mean, she elaborate. Every translator takes their own little. She made a big twist on it, and then of course Shakespeare takes it and takes a even greater twist on it, which I believe is autobiographical twist that is happening there with the Shakespeare version. But I do think it's interesting that you have these references to Julius Caesar being murdered in performances at a university where he is killed at the Capitol. And then, later on in Hamlet,
Yes.
you have Polonius talking about having performed Julius Caesar and having been murdered at the Capitol, which is very specific to Shakespeare's play because it's not historically accurate. That is not where Julius Caesar was actually murdered. It happens that way in the play, but that's not how it happens in Plutarch's Lives. That's not the historical reference that we have. So Polonius is basically saying, I performed in Shakespeare's play when I was in college. That would have been, how old is Polonius? I mean, he's in his late 60s, early 70s at least. How long ago would that have been? That play would have existed for a very long time then.
Right. I mean, I don't know. Obviously, it wasn't Shakespeare's play, but I think this masque that was performed in 1562 really was the first known depiction of Shakespeare, of Julius Caesar as a character in a play, as far as I know.
And what we don't have is any evidence or any logical reason why we should believe that the man from Stratford would have had access to any of these performances, would have had any type of connection or inclination to connect with any of these universities or the Inns of Court or any of the places where these early masques and court dramas would have been performed.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And I think I forgot to mention that Orthodox scholars think that Julius Caesar was written in around 1599 or 1600. So we're talking like a 30-year span of when probably at least the first incarnation of the play was written. And we even have two early allusions to Julius Caesar by Christopher Marlowe, The Image of Blood Dropping from Heaven. That was in Marlowe's circa 1587 play Tamburlaine the Great, Part 2. And also in his Massacre of Paris of circa 1593, he repeats the phrase, Caesar shall go forth. He says it twice, and it's also the same phrase is said twice in Julius Caesar.
Let's shift gears to one of my favorites that I was so glad to see that you included in your work, because it's one of those ones that really gets talked about a lot with the difference between what orthodoxy believes about the play and what authorship skeptics believe about the play. And it's, of course, the bloody tragedy of the Scottish king Macbeth. And you point out, and it made so much more sense to me in your descriptions there, that Macbeth is most likely depicting in a very timely manner and at a very specific time, poking directly at the murder of Lord Darnley by her lover, the Mary Queen of Scots, and that her and her lover plotting to murder her husband is probably the impetus in what we're seeing there, and makes so much more sense that play would be written and presented for Queen Elizabeth to help illegitimize her cousin and any claim her cousin might have to her throne than it makes any sense at all that play would have been written for James and shown to James depicting his mother murdering his father.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no question. In fact, of those 17 known Shakespeare plays performed before James, one of them was not Macbeth. So that was left out for sure. But this Shakespeare play, I think, too early Shakespeare play, a court play was called Tragedy of the King of Scots. And this is during the season of July 1567 to March 1568. And of course, Shakespeare's play, the full title is Tragedy of Macbeth. So it's almost like the tragedy of the King of Scots, and Macbeth was the Scottish king. So yes, in February of 67, Henry Stuart, the Lord Darnley, was assassinated, and he was 21 years old. And that forced Mary Queen of Scots' abdication in July of that year. According to an act of Parliament, she was complicit with the Earl of Bothwell, her lover, right, as you mentioned. And Darnley was called king by contemporaries. So you have this, great illusion of King Duncan being murdered by Macbeth in the same by somebody who was very ambitious for the throne, and that's a certain parallel with the Earl of Bothwell. But there are also some historical parallels in Macbeth with Lord Darnley's murder. And we have Lillian Winstanley to thank for that, a historian, that she wrote a book in 1922. And I'm just going to list them quickly. Lord Darnley went to Kirk of Field, where the murder took place, because it was a place of good air. And also Queen Mary and Bothwell conversed shortly before the murder. Lord Darnley and 2 servants were murdered in bed at night. And Lord Darnley's father, the Earl of Lennox, accused Bothwell of murder and pressed for a trial. Now, all of those points occur in Macbeth. And also, interestingly, which again, this was something new to me, that a picture was drawn of the murder scene, or at least where Darnley and a servant were found dead in a field. And in this picture of this occurrence was drawn a dagger that was pointing at the 2 dead bodies. And I'm sure you are well aware, in Macbeth, it is the hallucination of a dagger that Macbeth follows toward Lord Duncan's room. Am I right?
I have produced and directed the play 4 times. In fact, I'm doing it again in June of 2024. And I can tell you that those are almost direct allusions that you find in the play. When Duncan arrives at Macbeth's castle, one of the first things he says is, "This castle hath a pleasant air. It is a pleasant seat." And then he commends Lady Macbeth as she descends down the stairs. It's usually how I like to depict it. Depends on whether you have 2-story set or not. Yes, the king is murdered and both servants are murdered. Macbeth himself runs in and murders the servants once the thanes have arrived and discovered the dead king. And immediately Macduff says, "Why did you do that? Why did you kill the servants? That we needed to question them." And Macbeth says, "Oh, I was in such a fury. I lost control of myself." And of course, there is the very important scene where he sees the image of the floating dagger, and is hallucinating this dagger.
Yes.
that points him to do the deed he's supposed to do. There's also another reference that's made in the historical account that is also in the play, and it is Macbeth who, near the end of that speech, basically speaks to the stones and says, "Don't record my steps. Don't tell where I am and what I'm about to go and do." And there's another allusion there that's earlier than the play, that's then included in the play, to that sort of ideology of the earth recording your deed and telling of your deed. And then you're absolutely right. It is the Thane, it is Lennox who is the one who is accusatory at first, who says, "I think something's not right here. I think he played a dirty deed to get this crown." And that's like, what more do you need there? You want to talk about a bell ringing. I mean, it's not, he doesn't even change the name. He just takes Lennox and makes him Lennox. I mean, it's pretty similar. It's pretty crazy, right?
Absolutely. And, the Earl of Oxford was living in Cecil's home at this time as his ward. So any sort of state documents like that picture that was, sent to Lord Burleigh. So, Oxford may have had access to it, as well as certain accounts by the ambassador there, the English ambassador there. Like, for example, a letter to Cecil says the Queen, this is after the murder of Darnley, the Queen Mary was melancholy or sickly and had falling sickness, and that she was suicidal. And these could apply easily to Lady Macbeth.
There
And
are
also,
other
none of
characters
these
that have falling
details-
sickness. Julius Caesar has the falling sickness, they say in the play. Othello has the falling sickness. He goes into an epileptic seizure in the middle of the play, and Iago stands over him and says, "Let it work." And then gives this little aside to the audience before reviving Othello. That's a very interesting connection there too.
Right. And I mean, remember that Orthodox scholars say this play was written in 1605-06. And, that's many decades later when it was totally non-topical.
And they like to claim that Banquo is an ancestor of James, and that it was written in order to help legitimize James, and that when Macbeth sees the visions at the end, and the multiple kings that are going to rise up from Banquo's issue, including the final image that is holding the scepter and the ball like the kings of England, that the whole thing was written specifically for James. Well, it could be that those little tidbits were added in 1604 or 1605 to make James happy. But there's no way that this play was written for James. That doesn't make any sense to me at all, that he would even want to see anything like this.
Yes, showing his mother as complicit to a murder. But even an actor in 1600, William Kemp, you've mentioned him, in his book 9 Days' Wonder, mentions a penny poet whose first work was a story stolen from a work that sounds like Macbeth. He says, a penny poet whose first making was the miserable, stolen story of Macdole, or Macdobeth, or Mac somewhat, for I'm sure a Mac it was, though I never had the maw to see it. Maw is stomach. So an actor saying he's seeing this story is almost certainly was dramatic. One that, sort of turned his stomach. And this is 1600, and the scholars still say Macbeth was written in 1605-06. Yeah,
well, and I guess that tosses Kemp out as having ever played the porter in the famous comedic scene in the play of the porter, which you would think that Shakespeare's greatest comedian, if the play was written when orthodoxy says it was written, would have played that role. But here you have, in his own words, him saying that he's never even seen the play, let alone performed in the play, because it predates him and it predates that time. So, there's a nail in that coffin right there, if you ask me.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Let's move on to what I believe to be one of the greatest plays ever written. It is one of the most perfect plays ever for the stage. I just recently produced and directed it again for the 5th time, and it's Much Ado About Nothing. I love that play. There's the legend that James himself loved that play. In fact, I believe there's a historical reference of him referring to it as that Beatrice and Benedict play. In somebody's journal or somebody's diary. I forget that reference, but he obviously enjoyed it because of those two characters. Let's talk a little bit about that play that I love so much.
Yeah, well, we have 2 court plays. First, it's called A History of Ariodante and Genevora in February of 1583, which Queen Elizabeth saw, and another one, Panisha, recorded as Panisha, of December of 1574. And how we come to the conclusion that these may be early versions of Much Ado About Nothing are these character names, which occur in sources that Shakespeare used for his own play. So Ariodante and Genevora are from Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, his poem, and which was a source for Much Ado About Nothing, where Genovora, like Hero, is accused of infidelity by Ariodante, Claudio, for Shakespeare, and based on false accusations. So by having these character names, a play about these characters is going to be close to Ariosto's poem, and therefore probably the plot of this court play. Also, Panisha, which was the earlier one, 1574, it was probably written down incorrectly. It was probably meant as Venetia, which is a character in Bandello's novel of a wronged heroine, which was also a Shakespeare source for Much Ado About Nothing. So those conclusions by Eva Turner Clarke, she says this points to Much Ado About Nothing. And that's pretty much all I have, other than a few too early allusions to this play. The expression "as sound as bell," which is in the play, was also reflected in Thomas Newton's 1576 translation of The Touchstone of Complexions. It's a translation. And also Thomas Nash's Strange News of 1592, "civil as a civil orange." That exact phrase also appears in Much Ado About Nothing.
It does indeed. Beatrice is talking about Claudio, who is feeling jealous because he believes that Don Pedro has done him wrong by wooing Hero for himself instead of in his own name like he said he would. And she refers to him as civil and somewhat of that complexion, like an orange. We think today green to be the color of jealousy, but at the time, orange was considered the color of jealousy. And that's what she's saying, is he's jealous, but he's keeping it in a civil way by masking it, hiding it beneath the surface. And that's a very unique turn of phrase that you don't see or find. Yes. In fact, even in Shakespeare, you do find later on in Othello, Iago refers to jealousy as the green-eyed monster. So we see that that's where the shift occurs. But one of the things that I think is interesting about these early plays that use the actual names of the characters from the source material that then later gets converted to different names, that conversion, it would seem to me, makes total sense to a writer who wrote these plays based on the source materials, then took a trip to Italy for 15 months, and then came back and rewrote the plays and made them better and made it more lush, create some new characters, add some Italian references that he now knows for a fact because he's experienced places like Messina, where the play is set, where he has experienced Florence and refers to Claudio, the young Florentine, where he has been to Padua, where Benedict is from. He's a young Paduan. It's a very interesting connection. Those dates of those early performances that you mentioned are pre-Oxford's trip to Italy. And then all of these changes that we see in Much Ado About Nothing would make sense after a trip to Italy. I think that's another bell that we could ring.
Absolutely. Yes.
The next one I want you to talk about is one that people don't really like to talk about, but it's one of my favorite plays. I love the play. People think I'm crazy because I love the play. But Titus Andronicus, I believe, is one of the least understood or most misunderstood plays in the entire canon. It is not produced often because of how bloody and how tragic it is. But I think it's a beautiful play with beautiful messages. And you have some details that you found that can date the play to much earlier than we would think, but later in the life of the Stratford man than orthodoxy is interested in dating it. And I think that's the interesting aspect here.
Right. Well, Titus Andronicus, according to conventional dating, is circa 1592 to 94, that area right here. Now, interestingly, a document was found, a manuscript, a drawing of a scene from Titus Andronicus. And it's not only just a scene, but also it's accompanied by text. And it's a manuscript that's now at Longleat House in Somerset. And it's signed Henricus Peacham, which is Latin for Henry Peacham. And it also features the date. But unfortunately, it's not in numerals. It's in abbreviations of Latin words. And I don't have it like with me right now. It's like Q something. It's unusual. And it's that they call a chronogram. So this chronogram, by orthodoxy, they don't usually talk about it very much, but they dated the chronogram as 1594 or 95, what the Latin abbreviations represent. Okay. And so they think that therefore it was the whole sketch and the text was written by Henry Peacham the Younger. But an Oxfordian, David Roper, wrote a great article a number of years ago that the chronogram actually represents 1575, and that it was therefore made by Peacham the Elder when he was about 28 years old. His son was not yet born, and he was a scholar and an author. So I had that in my mind. I knew about this chronogram. But I found that in June of 1575, Queen Elizabeth visited her property at Hatfield Palace. So interestingly, the elder Peacham was a curate of a church very close to this property. So it's very possible that he was invited to see a play at Hatfield that the Queen was seeing. He could have been among the people in the audience. But also, just before she visited Hatfield Palace, she had visited Lord Burleigh's house, Tibballs. So it's possible that she saw it either one, and they're only like 9 miles apart. So it's very possible that that's what the drawing represents.
Now, is this the same Hatfield where she was raised before she became queen? Is this where it was her residence before she became queen?
And then later it was acquired by the Cecils, I think, after she died.
I was just there in October last year in that very gathering hall, and it just makes my hair stand on end to think that I was sitting in the same room where the very first performance of Titus Andronicus may have been performed before the queen herself in her what basically amounts to her childhood home. And that's an incredible thought. And what I wish I had known this while I was there, because it just would have enriched my experience being in that room even further. But that's an incredible account there, especially because while we were there, we heard one of the docents give a story that is the very same room where Queen Elizabeth entertained the lords and earls of England for the very first time as their sovereign queen. She received the news from Burleigh, who came there to tell her that her sister was no longer queen, that she was now the queen, and he kept her there and prepped her there. And all of the lords and earls came to gather there first to be addressed by her for the very first time as queen in that same room. So that would be a really interesting, exciting thing to add to the history of that hall, is the first performance of Titus Andronicus. Also, your dating, then, the orthodoxy, they say, oh, it was Shakespeare's Juvenilia. It's such an early play because look at how bloody and gruesome, and it stylistically is such a amateur piece, and it belongs at the very early beginning of his career. But your dating would speak otherwise, and I say otherwise. I say it's a master work of Greek allusion that proves that the author of the play knew the Greek writers and knew them up and down and knew his mythology and uses it throughout the entire play, left and right. It's a magnificent play. So that just makes me very excited to see what you found there about this play.
Yeah, I mean, I can't prove it that, it was performed there, but thanks to the snapshot by the elder Peacham, the play and text, this very well may have been. it and done there. And also, it's been noted by scholars that there was an extra character in the scene that's being depicted that wasn't in the printed version, first printed versions. And also some of the text that was underneath it was also a little bit different than the printed text later on, many years later. So, this is a very exciting document. And also it was found in the papers of Sir Michael Cecil, who was Burleigh's secretary. So that also lends itself that it was either performed at Burleigh's home or the nearby palace.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think that play is uncomfortable for Orthodox scholars. I think it's one of the reasons why they are so dismissive of it. Of course, its bloody nature makes it easier to be dismissive of that play, but I think that play helps unlock a lot of keys to the mystery of who the real writer of Shakespeare is. And I think you just helped add a layer to that mystery there.
Yes, and interestingly, George Peele really knew this play because he echoed some exact phrases in some of his works. So circa 1580, The Tale of Troy, he uses the phrase wise Laertes' son, and that changing piece. Those two phrases must have been taken from Shakespeare. Also, the exact phrase laden with honors spoils in 1589, the Eclogue Gratulatory, and Gallop the Zodiac, which was in his 1591 De Census Astrea, regarding a queen. And in the play, it's the Empress.
Yeah, Tamara, which ironically it ends up married to Saturninus. And of course, Saturn being a very important part of the zodiac and the planet of the Sagittarian, I believe. And you have characters in Shakespeare who talk about being born under the sign of Saturn, and therefore, them being aggressive and fiery. And in fact, in Much Ado About Nothing, Don John says to Conrad or Barachia, one of his henchmen, he says, I marvel that thou, being born under the sign of Saturn, as thou say thou art, that you are so mild and you do not have the stomach for the types of carnage I want to commit upon these people. It's a very interesting connection there to the zodiac. Let's move on to The Solitary Knight, because that really astounded me, and I hadn't seen anything like that before. And Pericles is such an interesting and sort of enigmatic play that I believe is like one of the apology plays from an Oxfordian position. I believe it's an apology play. It's him apologizing to Anne and to his daughter Elizabeth for those first 5 years that he was estranged from Anne and would not acknowledge Elizabeth as his child. That sort of lost daughter and then reunion story that happens. It does have the hallmarks of being a very early work. But how does that relate to the dating of what happens in Oxford's life then, where we see this sort of apology happening through the play with regards to what you found about earlier versions regarding this Solitary Knight?
Yes, the history of The Solitary Knight was a court play in February of 1577. And I think it refers to Pericles, which Orthodoxy puts it circa 1607 or to 1610. I base it on character descriptions and props in the Rebels play. Eva Turner Clark thought it was Timon of Athens or Timon of Athens. But I don't think that the properties that they wrote down that they needed for the play, armor with a base and targets, was not appropriate for Timon of Athens. Timon was a lord, and the play had nothing to do with targets and armor. So we're not talking about a knight. But in Pericles, he was often referred to as a knight. And of course, one of the main pivotal scenes is when Pericles competes in a tournament with armor and other knights. So it's a little bit more suitable. He becomes solitary when his wife dies in childbirth and he leaves his infant daughter in another land. So he is solitary again, and then he goes back to Tyre and is the, Prince of Tyre again. Also, there was another play, which I agree with Eva Turner Clarke, called A Pastoral or History of a Greek Maid. And that was January of 1579. And the Greek maid would be a reference to Marina, his daughter, who was kidnapped and sold to a brothel in the Greek city of Mytilene. So she's a Greek maid. And she's several times in the play called a maid. And also in this pastoral or history of a Greek maid is a fisherman's coat. And of course, Pericles was, I don't know if he was rescued, but he was taken care of by fishermen that gave him food and clothing. So that was a pivotal scene. So important. And also, I do have a few, an interesting parallel here. In Pericles, knights in this tournament, before the tournament, knights displayed their shields, mottos to the Princess Thaisa. And after the tournament, they danced with ladies in the king's court, right? So that's kind of an interesting scene. Now, these same events occurred in A Mask of Knights, which was another court entertainment for the queen. It was just a week after A Pastoral or History of a Greek Maid. So that's a very interesting parallel, that it may have been a reenactment from a scene of Pericles. And this is the description. A mask of knights, all likewise in armor complete, murions, which are soldiers' hats, upon their heads, with feathers in the tops, large baldricks, which are chains, about their neck, and black gold tinsel, truncheons in their hands, gilt and gilded shields with a posy written on every one of them. The knights had danced a while with ladies before her majesty. So that's an interesting parallel.
Definitely, indeed. And it brings such a new level to our understanding of the play Pericles and its evolution. If you're correct, then we see this evolution of this play that started off as the story of the solitary knight. Then this story of the maid Marina gets incorporated into it. This mask is either added in or it is performed and played out because of how much everyone enjoyed watching it performed on the stage in play form, and a week later decide, hey, let's just do that. Why don't we all do that? That would be fun.
Yeah.
And, I think we have to, as modern day sleuths here, we have to constantly remind ourselves of what entertainment was like in the 16th century, as opposed to what we view entertainment like today. Even though earlier in the episode, I talked about the parallels of how works evolve and can change title and can change form. And every play I've ever been associated with, from initiation to performance, always goes through these metamorphoses through what we call a workshop series or sessions that occur. And it just seems to me like that was happening then. But what we're not aware of, I don't think, is how they would run out of things to do. They didn't have Netflix and Hulu and Prime, and, they didn't have all of the content that we have at our fingertips. So they would sort of recreate content and make content up as they went along. And it certainly makes sense to go, that scene in that play we watched the other night? Why don't we all do that? That would be fun. And sort of have a dance. Yeah. You know what I mean? That makes total sense to me.
And they already had the costumes already,
Exactly. I do that all the time. The members of my Shakespeare company here in Southern Oregon, we meet together. We started a new tradition last year. We have a 12th night party. And we just open up the costume shed and pull out costumes that we've all worn before in performances or in other shows. And we put them on. We have a big 12th night celebration. And, we crown the king and queen of misrule and do some other traditional 12th night activities and have a lot of fun together, because that's what actors do. Actors don't just have a party. There always has to be a theme. There has to be a costume involved. That's just what we do. But yeah, you recycle that stuff. You have to. It's cost effective. And if you have it, why not use it? I just this last birthday, I had a Western theme because I have a whole rack of Western costumes in my costume shop from when I did As You Like It as a Western many years ago. So you just pull that stuff out, put it on, and have fun.
And you would say also that Pericles was an early play, right? I mean,
I would say that it has all the hallmarks of an earlier work.
Yeah.
And that's why I asked about the thing that kind of gets me is, if it's an earlier work, then can it still be Edward's sort of confession about the way he treated Anne and Elizabeth? But then again, you could combine those together and say, well, he took this earlier work and then sort of fleshed it out after he was having this remorse in his life after Anne's death. And I believe he really suffered tremendous guilt after she died for the way that he treated her, because I think he came to learn that what had happened was not her fault, and that what had happened was actually his fault, that she had been raped in order to get at him, to punish him. And I think he struggled with that throughout his life once he came to that realization.
Yes, that's an interesting theory. Yeah, that it could be right. But how they can, Orthodox scholars, how they can date it to circa 1607 or later, it's unbelievable. It's obviously an early work. And also it was also one of the worst surviving works. I mean, it was in the first quarto, is in terrible condition.
It's true, and you don't see it performed very often. I did see a really remarkable production of it at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival many years ago. That just made me fall in love with the play like I had never really appreciated it before, which is what live performance can do for these works, But it's not. It's not the greatest. It's definitely not a master. It's not a Hamlet. It's not a Lear. Right. It's not a Much Ado About Nothing. Yeah. Two other plays that are like that for me are Two Gentlemen of Verona and Cymbeline, which I believe smack of being much earlier works. They're just not as good, and they're seldom performed for that reason. And you placed them at somewhere around 1570, between 1577 and 1579, which makes much more sense to me as to where they would fall in the canon stylistically.
Well, yes, this is on record, these court plays. One of them in February of 1577, The History of Titus and Giuseppus. In December 1579, A History of the Duke of Milan and the Marquess of Mantua. And in January of 1585, History of Felix and Philomenia. So I mean, it's very obvious that Sylvia, the character Sylvia, is a representation of Queen Elizabeth. And maybe that's why these three plays were, as Two Gentlemen of Verona, were played so often. But the reason why Eva Turner Clarke just believes that these are Shakespeare's plays is from the characters Titus and Giuseppus. They were names taken from the Book of the Courtier of 1534 by Sir Thomas Eliot. And these characters, Titus and Giuseppus, they're best friends, and they are in a love triangle with Sophronia. And Giuseppus, when he finds out how lovesick Titus is, he gives her over to Titus, just as Valentine surrenders his beloved Sylvia to Proteus and Two Gentlemen. So that's, they base that on these character names, which were in a previous novel with probably a similar plot. Also, the play of the Duke of Milan and the Marquess of Mantua. The In Two Gentlemen of Verona, the Duke of Milan banishes Valentine, who later becomes the leader of outlaws in the forest of Mantua. And Mantua is a marquisate. So therefore, it's kind of, the dueling Duke of Milan with the outlaw, quote unquote, Marquess of Mantua. So that could be another reference to Two Gentlemen. And then the third one, the history of Felix and Philomena, was based on one of Shakespeare's sources, Montemayor's Diana Enamorada in 1542. And Felixmina in this work was disguised as a boy, becomes a page to her beloved, Don Felix. And Felix was anglicized in a translation of Montemayor's work. And Felicima employs the page to woo his love, Celia. So a similar situation happens in Two Gentlemen of Verona with Julia, Proteus, and Sylvia, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, and of course,
Stephen.
the Orthodox scholars love to point to this play as being proof that it was Shakespeare of Stratford, because he wouldn't have known that Milan is a landlocked city and there couldn't have been all of these ship voyages and all of this talk of waterways until we learned that the canal system that existed at the time was the number one route in and out of Milan. And especially amongst the nobility who could afford to pack all their stuff up on a barge and have it pulled along the canal rather than load it all into carts and have to be pulled by horses over bumpy, lumpy roads. It was a much better way to travel, to just sit on a nice barge and float down the canal with all of your goods and wares calmly and peacefully, as opposed to have to ride over land. So we learned that it's, very much a work that proves that whoever wrote it was there, had been there, and had experienced that. One of the reasons why the canals were so much more prevalent for noblemen to use for travel as well was because of the bandits that plagued the roads system. And so you were safer if you traveled by canal, because those bandits that we see pop up in Two Gents couldn't get to you. You're on the water, which is one of the reasons why I've only produced the play once, because it's a difficult play to get past an audience, especially with, the almost rape scene that occurs. But one of the things we did was we gave it a pirate theme, and we turned the bandits into pirates, and we really accentuated the waterways aspects. And, of course, pirates, what do? They rape, pillage, and plunder. And it made that very uncomfortable scene, not to make light of it and to turn it into, turn rape into something that's funny. But it definitely, it is a comedy, and it made it much easier for the audience to get past those moments that are awkward in the play and just enjoy it as the story that it is.
Yes. I wasn't able to find a lot of too early allusions to this work, but I found one in, again, back to Arthur Brooke in Romeos and Juliet, 1562. He gives the method of climbing into a window of a beloved with a cord's ladder, quote unquote, and iron hooks, which is in Two Gentlemen of Verona, the same phrase, a ladder made of cords and anchoring hooks. So that might be a sign that this was a really early play based on that. But also in 1578, we have John Lilly, his line about secret love in Euphues, the Anatomy of Wit, 1578, the fire kept close burneth most furious. And in Two Gentlemen of Verona, fire that's closest kept burns most of all. So that might be an echo. And of course, Lilly was Oxford's secretary. And also Lilly in his play Endymion, 1578, love is a chameleon which draweth nothing into the mouth but air, and nourisheth nothing in the body but lungs. And in Two Gentlemen of Verona, Speed says, though the chameleon love can feed on the air, I am one that am nourished by my victuals.
And Speed being a servant type character, I often wonder if Speed isn't a nickname for John Lilly.
Oh.
See what I did there? And I wonder if there's some other references somewhere, and who then would Valentine be? Because we do see characters named Valentine in other plays that are servant characters to noblemen. And so I wonder if we're looking at that from a different perspective. If Edward de Vere is the writer, and if he is, pulling in some of his surrounding cohorts into the play and using nicknames for them, I wonder if we couldn't sort of map out some characters that way. And maybe, as you mentioned there, Speed basically is reciting Lily, or Lily is reciting Speed. Maybe they are one and the same figuratively.
I like that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to do some study on that.
Something that, like Pistol and Nym, those characters,
right?
And Henry IV may also have been some writers in his circle, Oxford circle.
Yeah, that would be an interesting rabbit hole to sort of dig down deep into and see what kind of connections could be further developed there. I think that would be an interesting place to kind of see what we could come up with. You mentioned Cymbeline, and I mentioned it just a moment ago. And one of the things I love about Cymbeline, just want to touch on before moving on to another piece, is that, I sort of see Cymbeline as, the number one source for Walt Disney. And Disney has Shakespeare to thank for the creation of the original Wicked Stepmother. And I don't know if there are other moments in literary history that predate Cymbeline where the Wicked Stepmother is prevalent, but certainly in Cymbeline, that is like, the plot line is like one of the most important pieces to the plot line. And, when we look at modern day stories, it certainly is, one of the most common strains that we find in, especially in Disney.
And isn't it interesting that we have a court play in 1578 called A History of the Cruelty of a Stepmother, And in Shakespeare's play of Cymbeline, Cymbeline or Cymbeline is the king, and his second wife is called stepmother or stepdame throughout the play. She doesn't have a name. And she was twice called cruel in the play, among other names, tyrant and a few other things. So she was really supposed to be a wicked stepmother for sure. And it may have been the very first depiction of a wicked stepmother on the stage. But Eva Turner Clarke threw out a very interesting factoid that in Cymbeline, his two sons were dead, and Imogen, who was the lady protagonist, was his only child. And of course, the wicked stepmother wanted her to marry her child by another marriage, her son. And of course, she beat him to it. She married posthumously in Otis. So that she foiled her plans. And I think that's why she was wicked. But Queen Elizabeth in 1578 had been on the throne for 20 years, which was after the deaths of her two siblings, Edward and Mary. So that was an interesting parallel and could help, date the play. And also we do have a few literary allusions that might work. Again, the court play was in December of 78, and in 1580, we have the civil conversation to tear him limb meal. That's an unusual phrase, and that was also in Cymbeline. Another one, Lily again, Campapsi, 1584, Hark, hark, the lark at heaven's gate sings. Another one by Green in his quip for an upstart courtier, 1592, How Creeps Acquaintance. Another good one, Nash's Christ's Tears, 1593. He says, Mine eye strings cracked. Mine eye strings cracked, also in
That's a
Cymbeline.
very interesting turn of
Jove
phrase.
says, yes. And another one, Jove says, to my palace crystalline. Jove, the god, saying, let's go to my palace crystalline. And that phrase also applied to Jupiter, to my palace crystalline in Thomas Edwards' Cephalus and Procris, 1593.
So let's look at Cymbeline for a second and from that perspective and go, okay, well, by all accounts, Queen Elizabeth did not have a wicked stepmother. She had a good stepmother, right? And we, from what we can tell from Catherine Parr, who basically became her stepmother, that she had a pleasant experience there. So she didn't have a wicked stepmother. And certainly Catherine Parr wasn't trying to push Elizabeth into marrying anyone. If anything, we have these ideas that perhaps Catherine Parr's husband, Lord Seymour, was actually having a fling with Elizabeth. So that's not a storyline that fits there, but here's a storyline that does fit in. And let me ask you this question. Is the wicked stepmother in Cymbeline meant to be Mildred Cecil forcing Imogen, Edward, to marry her daughter, Anne?
That never occurred to me. I mean, it's certainly possible. But I believe, and it's very possible that that it could have been allusion to Alençon's mother, who was known to have knowledge of poisons, herbal poisons.
Yes, the Medicis, right? Yeah, sure. Maybe.
Yes, Catherine.
It's
Catherine de Medici. Yeah,
and she wanted to force Elizabeth to marry her son, the Duc d'Alençon, right? So that's another parallel. That's another interesting parallel. But it did just dawn on me. I was thinking, well, who had a wicked stepmother? Well, actually, technically, Edward de Vere had a wicked stepmother. He did not get along with Mildred Cecil. They were not. They were not pals. But she basically becomes his mother when he becomes a ward of the court and is sent to live in the Cecil household. And he is then forced to marry Mildred's daughter, Anne, against his will. So there's a little interesting parallel there that I think might be worth exploring.
I think that's very, very apt. Yes, very interesting.
Before we close off, there's a couple others that I really want to touch on before we complete the episode. And the one particularly that I want to touch on first, and it connects back to what we're talking about with this relationship with Edward and Anne. And it's All's Well That Ends Well. And many of us who are Oxfordians believe that All's Well That Ends Well is the biggest apology play to Anne, that Helena represents Anne in many ways. I mean, here again, we have that story where you have this leading character, this nobleman who is being forced to marry this commoner by the sovereign. So in this case, it was Elizabeth forcing Edward to marry Anne based on the Cecil's wishes there as well. And here in All's Well That Ends Well, you have this similar situation happening with it's a king, not a queen. And Helena is elevated in order to make it so that she is not a commoner, but that argument is taken off the table. But your dating of All's Well That Ends Well doesn't actually correspond then to what we would look at and say the dating of Anne's death and it becoming an autobiographical sort of apologetic play, or does it? How does that overlay, or does it?
Well, yeah, it is earlier. I mean, Oxford returned to his wife in late 1581, and this court play, The History of the Rape of the Second Helene, January of 1579. So it is a little bit early in that sense. But, it could have been the first version and then later, developed into, like you mentioned, an apology. But the reason why there's a parallel is because the first Helen was Helen of Troy, and and she was mentioned in the play too. And she was raped in the sense of being seduced. That's Helen of Troy by the Trojan prince Paris, right? So the character, Helena, her rape was seduction by her unknowing husband, Bertram, thinking that she was another woman. As you mentioned, he married her against his will and left her after the ceremony. And he turned to this lady, Diana, who I wonder, was not really meant to be Queen Elizabeth II. But she was warned by her about Bertram, right? To beware of him and his servant. Their promises, enticements, oaths, tokens, and all these engines of lust are not the things they go under. Many a maid hath been seduced by them. So this just points out that it is a seduction as opposed to a real rape. And then, of course, there's the famous bed switch, the bed trick, which has been noted in history that happened to the Earl of Oxford. We know that. So that's about, that's the closest we can come.
So then it makes me wonder if...
And Helen, yeah.
In 1579, you have this play, The Rape of the Second Helen. And if you look at the origins, like as you mentioned, Helen of Troy, it depends on which Greek tragedian you're reading, whether or not Helen is depicted sympathetically that Paris seduced her and abducted her, or whether she goes willingly with her young lover to Troy.
Yeah.
Like I said, it depends on whether you're reading Sophocles or Euripides or which tragic playwright from the Greeks do you want to look at and how they depict her. In the Trojan Women, Menelaus casts her off and calls her guilty of being an adulteress. So here you have this idea then with her that you could have, if the Earl of Oxford is the author, that he's sort of playing with. Was she raped, or was she a willing participant? He's also
yes.
floating out this cover story that his father-in-law has created for why his wife was pregnant when he believed he never actually consummated the marriage and then went off to Italy and then learns that he's going to be a father while he's in Italy. So here in this play is the first floating of the bed trick as the cover story in front of the court as a court drama being performed to see how people are going to buy that. Are they going to buy that? Is that going to save his honor? Is that going to save his face? And within 2 years, he does accept her in. He accepts the baby as his, and it seems to have worked. So now if that's the picture we're painting, this 1579 court performance, the rape of the second Helene, really fits that story perfectly, doesn't it? If you paint it out that way.
Yes.
That's so interesting. And of course, many people
and
have...
of course, orthodoxy.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say is,
I was just
many people believe
dates
that
1603,
Yeah, that's impossible. And many people believe, of course, that the rape of Lucrece is the same thing. It's telling the same story. The rape of Lucrece is sharing that he has now come to the determination, long since standing, that she was raped, that she was not a willing participant, and that the child that came from that he accepted as his daughter because it was his duty and obligation to do so, rather than to continue to accuse her and claim the child illegitimate.
Yeah, that's a very compelling argument. Yes. If we want to look at some allusions that may comport with the January 1579 dating of the court play, we have in The Golden Aphroditus of 1577 this line: "As cuckolds come by destiny, so cuckoos sing by kind," which is echoed in All's Well. Your marriage comes by destiny, your cuckoos sing by kind. And then also an interesting allusion by the author of The Art of English Poesy, 1589, in which Oxford was mentioned. The author paired a tennis ball analogy with an adage. So this is what this anonymous author, who I think was John Lord Lumley, he says, "Ye have another figure by which, by his nature, we may call the rebound, alluding to the tennis ball, which being smitten with the racket rebounds back again." And this is a figure of rhetoric. This playeth with one word written all alike, but carrying diverse senses, as thus. And then he gives an example. The maid that soon married is, soon marred is. And that is reflected in All's Well That Ends Well. Paroles said, "Why these balls bound? There's noise in it. 'Tis hard. A young man married is a man that's marred." So it was a very close compilation of two ideas occurring in two different works.
Absolutely. And of course, we know the very famous account of the falling out at tennis, young men falling out at tennis, Edward and Philip Sidney, and that very famous historical story. And then, of course, if you look at the tennis ball being somewhat like Edward and the racket being the queen, you definitely have that rebounding going on throughout. And then, the early married woman who is also early marred. Anne and Edward get married. Edward takes off and Anne is raped while he is gone. That all corresponds and connects. And it would make sense that so many people at court would know all these details, but not be able to speak them outwardly for fear of the retaliation and potential death that it could bring, but wanting to allude to them anyway in these, very symbolistic terms and, clever quips.
Exactly. And of course, it's fiction, right? So you get your ideas across in these quote unquote fictional entertainments. Another interesting factoid is Philip Henslowe, who was the theater director or producer.
Of course.
In March of 1598, he noted in his diary Perrault's suit for the actor William Sly. So this is a likely allusion to the character Paroles in All's Well That Ends Well. And Sly was in Henslowe's employ from 1590 to 1592. So dating the play to this earlier period. So that's a very interesting connection.
Meaning that it would have been performed during that time, which is, right. That means that it would have been performed somewhere in those early 1590s, right? Is what you're saying.
Publicly, that is publicly.
Right. Publicly. Now it's being publicly performed in the early 1590s, coincidentally, right before the publication of the very first work to carry the name of Shakespeare, Venus and Adonis, and then a year later, The Rape of Lucrece. So that also fits the storyline of, floating this out there to make this the new history of what happened between the Earl of Oxford and his wife and who these children are, Elizabeth de Vere, and of course, my belief system, Henry Wriothesley. That would be very interesting connections right there. And the timeline fits brilliantly.
Yes. Wow. I'm so glad that this works with your great interpretations.
Well, you should
write
it's all in my mind. Paper. I can't I prove nothing, but it sure does. Make a great movie. It would make a great movie.
Sure would.
Let's wrap up with A Midsummer Night's Dream because it's such an important piece. And because so many of us believe that Bottom is Alençon, and it makes so much sense that he is based on the jokes and, the fact that he refers to the fairies as Monsieur, and the fact that Peter Quince makes these jokes about French crowns having no beards. And I mean, there's just so many allusions there to the Alençon marriage debacle, I'll call it, that occur in that play. And we would need that play and those details to be post marriage debacle, not pre-marriage debacle. And how do the dates of the earlier court dramas that this play may have been connect to those events in history?
Right. Well, we have in December of 1584, it's a court play called A Pastoral of Phillida and Corin. Okay. And so in this case, we can pick out the characters mentioned. There weren't actual characters, but characters mentioned in Midsummer's Night Dream, which was also a pastoral. In this passage, where Titania, she's the queen of fairies, says to the king of fairies, Oberon, "Then I must be thy lady, but I know when thou hast stolen away from fairyland, and in the shape of Corin sat all day, playing on pipes of corn and versing love to amorous Phillida." So you have Corin and Phillida, these are the characters of this court play. So Titania is reminding Oberon that he had changed into a shepherd named Corin and wrote love verses to Phillida. And Midsummer's Night Dream is the only play to mention these two. They appeared as characters in a much earlier poem, a couple decades earlier. But this was the first play. So Shakespeare's Corin was really Oberon, the fairy king, transformed. So if Corin and Corin of the court play were the same character, then, here's our direct connection to A Midsummer's Night Dream and this court play. And it could have been an early version. But as you mentioned, there could have been earlier versions than that. And we have various entertainments of Queen Elizabeth encountering a fairy queen. And I have one, July 1575, when she visited Kenilworth Castle, which was in Warwickshire. Two different writers mention a mermaid singing on a dolphin's back in one of the entertainments. And Shakespeare's Oberon describes a mermaid singing while on a dolphin's back. It's the same thing.
Yeah, he's talking to Puck there, and he says, "Remember that time when we saw that? Well, I also saw this, which you didn't see. I saw Cupid shoot an arrow at this young Vestal reigning in the north," right? Basically, Queen Elizabeth. In other words, Cupid shot his arrow at Elizabeth and missed. And where that arrow landed, it struck a flower. And that's the flower I want you to bring me, because that's the flower that has the power of love at first sight.
Yes, and that same description of Oberon appeared in another entertainment of September 75, just a couple months later, at Woodstock. Let's see. The Queen of the Fairy, she's suddenly appears the Queen of the Fairy drawn with 6 children in a wagon of state. And they present Elizabeth with a rich gown. I mixed that up. That was another fairy queen appearance in an Elizabethan entertainment. Yes, here is it. 1578. The Queen's Majesty entertainment in Suffolk and Norfolk. Dame Chastity disarms Cupid and hands Cupid's bow to the Queen. And this is a quote: "To learn to shoot at whom she pleased, since none could wound her highness's heart. It was meet, said Chastity, that she should do with Cupid's bow and arrows what she pleased. And that also had, afterwards, it featured a dance of fairies, concluding with the Queen of Fairies speech addressed to Queen Elizabeth. So this is another enactment of Oberon's speech. So it's just something that he's saying, but they're, in my opinion, they're picking up these things and actually physically dramatizing them in separate entertainments for the Queen.
So at
because
the very,
she obviously loved.
Yeah, obviously she does. She loves these fairies. She loves the fairy stuff. But at the very minimum, what I'm hearing you say then is these documented early court entertainments are referenced by the character Oberon in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So at the very minimum, whoever wrote the lines for Oberon was present at those court entertainments and saw these things, and that's the only way that writer could give those words to this character in this play.
Absolutely. There you go. I mean, that's got to be the case. And yet, with all these court plays and entertainments that she saw that were probably Shakespeare, around 18 to 20, I've gathered, how come there's no reference to the writer William Shakespeare? Why is there no encounter between her and Shakespeare when she had encounters with several other writers and correspondences, like with John Lilly and Edmund Spenser, who she gave an annuity to, George Gascoigne? He personally gave her a manuscript in person. How come we don't have that correspondence? So that's what this study raises the question.
For the exact same reason that no one named William Shakespeare was ever called in to be questioned or tortured for anything that he wrote either, right? It's the exact same reason. There's no interaction with a pseudonym. You cannot interact with a fictional name. It's not possible. And so you have two sides of the same coin. There's no positive references or interactions, even though there's so much evidence that the Queen was enjoying performances and entertainments that must have been the earliest works of this writer that becomes later known as William Shakespeare. And remember, he doesn't become known as William Shakespeare until 1593. So here's 20 years of entertainment, almost, at least 15 years of entertainment happening before the name William Shakespeare is ever invented. And for the same reason, we don't have any, Francis Walsingham calling in any William Shakespeare to set him on the rack to say, why did you write this lampoon of my buddy William Cecil, or why did you mock the Queen and the Duke of Alençon this way in A Midsummer Night's Dream? How dare you make this reference to meddling monkey and busy ape? We know who you're talking about. That had to have been the Spanish ambassador Simeon and the Duke d'Alençon, right? I mean, so how does he get away with this? Well, because he's the longest standing Earl in the history of England. That's why.
And a favorite of the Queen.
Doesn't hurt. Certainly doesn't hurt to be a favorite of the Queen. And based on the historical facts that you point out at the very beginning of your paper, and as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, he was obviously also a favorite of the next sovereign, King James, who we know for a fact witnessed 17 different Shakespeare plays, many at his own request. That's important to note as well.
And why didn't the great author show up at these wonderful, such an incredible tribute to the great author? Why wasn't he there? The Stratford man was alive and well.
Well, you have really opened a great Pandora's box here with regards to dating, and I know you're familiar with Kevin Gilvari's wonderful work about the dating of the plays.
Yes,
and I think that a lot of what
I
have
used
here,
his work for mine.
It corresponds, obviously, but I think you've elaborated on some of them in a better way as far as finding references that could be the earliest drafts, the initial performances, the workshop performances, as actors would call them, as people in theater today would refer to it. Well, we workshop this before a test audience, And
Yes.
they didn't like this character, so let's change that. The title didn't really fly well. It didn't sell well. It doesn't really speak to what the play's about, so let's change that. Sometimes people, I don't know how many people go out to malls anymore, but sometimes you could be in the mall and they'll have these people with clipboards who will come up to you and ask you if you'd be willing to fill out a couple of questions. And oftentimes what they are is actually movie studios that are testing titles of films.
Ah.
And they will choose the title of a film based on initial audience test response in that way. And it's a very common practice in the film studio industry. So there's definitely throughout history a propensity for changing the titles of works in order to make them more palpable or more accurate or more audience friendly. And I think that's what we've seen with the Shakespeare works as well.
Yes. And I just want to again give, it's Eva Turner Clarke who really put these together. And my work is kind of, I think, an update of her work. And, I'm sure in next generations, they'll probably update mine. So and all to get at the truth of, in what order the plays were written and their date, the composition dates. We're all in that quest.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it right here. And if you want to read Catherine's full paper, you can find it in the special issue recently published of the Journal of Scientific Exploration, where you'll also find a lot of other really good work there by other Shakespeare authorship mystery sleuths and scholars. And we'll take a look at some of those other pieces and see if we can invite some of the other writers of those pieces to come here on the program for future episodes. Catherine, as always, it has been such a great pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time to share with us this incredible work and to indulge me on my fantasies of what it all means in my brain, at least.
Well, it was a great enjoyment to be on your show yet again. And I'm really grateful to all your listeners who enjoy hearing my talks. So I'm very thankful.
Is there anything you'd like to plug before you go? Is there anything you want people to go find? If you haven't found Catherine's great book, Shakespeare Suppressed, you need to do that. And you can find that at any of your regular book buying sites, I would assume, Catherine.
Yeah, well, I've been working on another book and I'm hoping to finish it this year, but who knows how long it'll take to lay it out and really complete it. But I think people are going to be very interested, and also people in the art world are going to be very interested. Not necessarily for the authorship question, but the authorship is in there. So it's going to be an exciting book when it comes out, and I will let you know.
Great. Very intriguing. And when that's ready, you let me know, and we will definitely have you back to discuss it and let people know how to find it, because we always love to plug new books here on the series. So that'll be fantastic. She is Catherine with a K, Chiljan, Chiljan. Find her online, find her work. And I know many of you have already been finding the episodes that she has done with me in the past. And I think this one will rank up there among the best as well. Thank you again, Catherine. Appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Before we wrap things up, Quiller Nation, I want to let you know how much we appreciate each and every one of you for your loyal support of this growing community of Shakespeare Super Sleuths. I particularly want to thank those of you who contribute every month through our Patreon page as loyal sponsors of the program, and those of you who have subscribed to our email newsletter. All of you should have by now received the full details about how to register for our inaugural Quiller event at the world-famous Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, Minnesota, coming in April. I want to tell you that certain events of that weekend will sell out. They will sell out. The special welcome cocktail reception, the special Brittle Glory Marathon Shakespeare Day of Performances will sell out. So you need to make sure you register today. And if you haven't received the info and you don't know what I'm talking about, then you need to join our subscriber list, which you can do from the homepage of our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. Just visit don'tquillthepodcast.com. Click on the subscribe link, follow the instructions so that you can stay informed about all things Quiller in nature. And keep an eye out for future episodes. In fact, we're going to be doing a very special episode coming up soon that will explain and describe the details of our April Quiller weekend. And of course, subscribers to the email newsletter will receive updates first regarding our lineup of special presenters, scenes from the canon regarding Shakespeare's knowledge of the law, and more. I'll give you a little tease. One of the scenes that will be presented by trained Shakespearean actors is the gravedigger scene from Hamlet, which will also be described, explained, and analyzed by our legal scholars who will be on hand at the event. That's just one of the highlights of the day. So make sure that you stay informed by subscribing to our email newsletter, and you'll learn all the details as they come, 1 at a time, 2 at a time, 5 at a time, 10 at a time. I can tell you with some great pleasure that one of the legal scholars that we will be inviting who has agreed to join us for the Quiller weekend is Bryan H. Wildenthal, law professor and great Shakespeare super sleuth, as well as author of a wonderful book about the early allusions to Shakespeare being Shakespeare and not being Shakespeare. So keep an eye out for more details. They'll be coming. I also want to announce a special Quiller contest. Those of you on the newsletter list know that part of the weekend includes a special marathon day of performances of 3 Shakespeare history plays presented back to back. Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V will be performed all in one day. It's an entire day of Shakespeare presented by the same company of 25 professional actors at the world-famous Guthrie Theater. And as part of our marathon package, we will be providing each attendee with a special certificate and a marathon medal to commemorate the day. If you attend that day, you will be able to display your medal with pride as one of the few, the lucky few, who will have been there as part of it all. What we are putting out there to all of you is a call to all graphic artists to help us design the marathon medal. These will be stamped in solid metal and attached to a stunning ribbon for display with the certificate or to be worn on the breast of a shirt or lapel of a jacket or wherever you wish to pin your medal. Or you can put it on the certificate and stick it in a frame and hang it beautifully on the wall. I expect that I'll be seeing people wearing their marathon medals at future Shakespeare authorship events. And if you're interested in designing this one-of-a-kind memorabilia collector's item, then please send your design ideas to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. That's contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. Some ideas that we're already bouncing around is, does it need to include Pallas Athena? Does it need to include the scales of justice? Does it need to include something about the kings of England and the history plays that we'll be seeing? Does it need to include the secret hand behind the curtain, writing the works of Shakespeare? Let your creative juices flow. The winning designer will be recognized at the event at the Guthrie and receive free registration for the events of the weekend. So get those creative juices flowing and submit your ideas ASAP to contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. In the meantime, make sure you watch your emails for more details about this incredible Shakespeare authorship event and make your travel plans today. With each new episode, we'll be sharing more details. Today, we shared some details about the performance. We shared some details about one of our presenters, Bryan Wildenthal. We'll be sharing more little by little, we'll trickle it out there for you to entice you. But some of these aspects of the event will sell out and will sell out quickly, including the wonderful room rate that we received at the historic Renaissance Hotel at the Depot, right along the mighty Mississippi River, just walking distance from the Guthrie Theater. Incredible rates of $135 a night. You can't beat that. So get in now before everything is gone. In the meantime, check those airfares, make those travel plans today, and keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.